striking and clear trend across all markets is that as we progress through the life cycle of the pandemic, concerns shift from health to economy, and people's thoughts shift to their own personal finances, their job prospects, and their future financial security. There's an equally strong belief that life will not be the same again after the pandemic. What that means in practice, what it will mean for our working practices, our daily lives, we don't know yet. But the British public, and in other markets too, believe there will be significant change. And there is great uncertainty about how long it will take for normal life to return. People in the UK believe normal working life will not return for anywhere between 6 months and 2 years. And we're seeing the same trends in the US, and notably also in Australia, even though increasing numbers of Australians believe they're at the late stages of the pandemic. So when do people think the right time to end isolation is? When asked if now is the right time to end isolation, the UK stands out starkly. 68% of people disagree that it's time to end the isolation in the UK. Only 20% agree. Opposition to ending lockdown is far higher in the UK than it is in the other countries polled. Compare this to the US, where 48% of people disagree with ending isolation now, and 32% agree it's the right time, a much more even result. So UK sentiment resounds strongly against ending isolation. And when isolation does end, the public's priorities at the heavy industries, construction, manufacturing, energy, are the first released, as well as banking and the finance sector, with more than 1 in 3 people putting these industries as their top 5 priority industries to be released from lockdown. And we see the same in the USA as well. But it is noticeable in Hong Kong, where the pandemic is more advanced. Focus has quickly shifted to lifting sectors vital for supporting international trade, business and investment, such as the airline sector, with a wide recognition of the need for international business and tourism to return to drive economic growth. Now, this reluctance in the UK to end lockdown appears something of a contradiction when you ask people in the UK to think about the economy. Because a net 59% of people believe the economy is performing poorly in the UK. That means 59% more believe the economy is performing poorly than well. In Hong Kong, that figure is 26%. There are a few other figures worth mentioning here. Firstly, the 1 in 3 people, 33% in the UK, currently fear redundancy. While that figure is obviously high, when you take a more global view, it is the lowest among the markets in which we're polling. In the US, 46% of people are fearing losing their job. And this is impacting financial decision-making. So the public in all markets are now more likely to make prudent financial decisions, such as increasing pension contributions, reducing personal debt, rather than maybe non-essential, risky or life-changing decisions, such as having a baby, buying a house or a car, or starting a new business. So despite thinking by a very large margin that the economy is doing poorly, the British people do not want isolation to end at the moment. The longer things go on, the worse the economy becomes, yet notwithstanding that, people in the UK still want the lockdown. So how well do people think the government and business is responding to the pandemic? In the public's mind, the UK government's handling of the pandemic has deteriorated by 23% in the last 2 weeks and is on a downward trend. Having said that, a net 17% still believe the government is handling things well rather than poorly. That is, 17% more think the government is handling things well than poorly. The US is in a worse shape with a net lead of handling things well of just 4%, and like the UK is on a downward trajectory. When asked how well or poorly the government is communicating about pandemic, we see a similar deterioration in both the UK and the US. But again, a net 24% of people in the UK still believe the government is communicating well on the pandemic. That is, 24% more believe the government is communicating well than poorly. So UK and US governments face some difficult decisions still, and at a time when confidence in their handling of the pandemic is declining. And of course, whatever the health-related decisions yet to be made, the economy looms even larger. Decisions about the economy and the nation's finances made so far, and those still to be made, will have effects for years and even decades to come. Hundreds of billions have been borrowed and spent as the recent CPS report outlines, and ever more is being demanded. And big government has arrived. Whenever and however we come out of lockdown, there is a simple reality. The influence and impact of government on the post-lockdown world will remain broader and deeper than most of us have ever witnessed. Record government spending and regulatory interventions, together with a fractured economy and uncertain business environment, mean that business is facing a new reality in dealing with governments. Uncertainty and change have been guaranteed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And questions about the state of the economy, global recession or depression, and the future of globalization are all being grappled with. So one issue that deserves a lot of attention, especially for businesses, is that of the role, expectations, and reach of government. Specifically, what is the best approach to pay down the government's coronavirus bailouts and stimulate economic growth? So when asked whether the public support more government intervention on business, so higher taxes, higher regulation, or less government intervention on business, lower taxes, less regulation, 41% of the British public say that they prefer more government intervention, whereas 36% say less intervention. Here the UK is somewhat of an outlier. Take, for example, the US, where 48% of people want less government intervention on business and just 30% say they want to see more. And we see the same trend in Hong Kong and Australia. But we do know that people are generally listening to government again, and trust is up. People are looking to government to lead. We also know that at times of crisis and uncertainty, people want clarity and decisiveness. They want to hear direct from their government, and they want just to hear the facts so that they can be the judge. But they're also letting government step in and participate across the economy more broadly and deeply before. Government has stepped into areas we would have not thought possible. And as such, we're seeing a few potential consequences of government's extended reach that will have major effects on many businesses and key sectors. Firstly, public expectations on government have changed now and for the future. The idea that something is not an area for government intervention will dramatically reduce, as any area could be up for grabs. Secondly, the sheer scale and size of the state is massively expanded as government spending has become girth-busting. Thirdly, funding the massive spending and the resulting government debt will lead to a push for economic growth, but also mean a new push for revenue sources. So what does this mean for business? When asked what tax increases they would support or oppose to help the government repay the bailout debt, a net 66% of people in the UK support tax increases for big business. That's 66% more support than oppose tax increases for big business. And a net 76% of people in the UK support tax increases for big tech firms. And while the UK public lead on this, there is overwhelming support in other markets across the US, Australia, and India, as you can see. So we can expect a return of calls to tax the rich, make big business pay, and joined by the distinctly 21st century message of hit the multinational tech companies. New death duties or a hike in property taxes, all these things could be pursued. But as we can see from the figures, governments at present have public support and the political cover to do so. And business will have to show how it can boost economic growth so that over time, debt as a proportion declines and markets have confidence in the financial stability and prospects of nations. So how does the public's view of business and business's response to the crisis shape up? Is big business perceived to be stepping up? When asked whether they agree or disagree that big business in general are doing enough to support society at this time, just 33% of the British public agree. And that number is not only falling week on week, it is a consistent trend across all markets. And despite demands, there is declining appetite for further government bailouts. Government policy developed in a crisis with the best of intentions can have dramatic long-term flow-on effects. Industry leaders, corporate affairs departments, and sector lobby groups will need to adjust and be much more effective, or they'll lose out to other voices and their businesses and members will suffer. But if business does not act, it will pay a very real price, and in the long run, so will the economy and the country too. There is a new battle taking place. So what do the public see as the priorities for business? In a forced choice, British people, and for that matter, Americans and Australians too, are split between whether business's primary responsibility is to contribute to the economy, make a profit, job protection and creation, or a wider responsibility to social purpose, environment, sustainability. 43% of the British public believe business's primary responsibility is economic growth, and 46% social responsibility. And this even split is seen in other markets. In the US, 41% believe the primary responsibility is economic growth and 46% social responsibility. And in Australia, the split is even closer at 45-43. The debate is in the balance, and with a decent number of undecideds to convince. Those don't knows at the bottom. But it is noteworthy that when we dig down further on government priorities post-pandemic, the public's focus is squarely on economic growth, strengthening the economy, job protection and creation. So when asked what are the top 3 priorities for the government in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, 44% of people in the UK say strengthening the economy and 39% say protecting and creating jobs. They're second only to investing in the health system. And the pattern is remarkably similar across all markets. Previously top-rating issues such as climate change have dropped significantly in this context down the priority order. If the last year saw an increasing emergence of ESG for public and corporate affairs, the impact of COVID-19 and government's responses to it mean that some of this may take a back seat to the very basic issues of business and sector survival, of taxes, costs, regulation, productivity and competitiveness. Finally, I'll end on one new dimension that we are seeing emerging from the pandemic, and that is of economic sovereignty. What strategically should we control, produce or supply here? Today we face a pandemic, but what about cyber terrorism hitting every financial centre and other future threats? This pandemic has disclosed a risk to globalisation by disrupting critical supplies. Areas where pursuit of economic sovereignty could impact include medical supplies, the defence industry, component supply, food, pharmaceuticals and energy. All could be targets with consequences for business. It is worth also thinking about the impact of globalisation's offer of just-in-time logistics, which are predicated on the assumption that products can come from anywhere in the world just in time so we can be hyper-efficient and avoid expensive stockpiling. Economic sovereignty leads governments to ask, how much do we rely on 1 or 2 countries as sources of supplies? And with a boot on the other foot, how much do we rely on any one country or geography to be the market for our products and resources? All these figures we have seen mean the role of government and new government policies will be pervasive and impactful for government. And to avoid paying an even longer term and higher price than it has during this pandemic, business needs to be ready to prosecute its case and defend its turf. And on that note, I'll hand back to Robert.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you also for perfectly hitting your allotted 15 minutes. An awful lot of stuff to chew over there, so I'll go first to Andrea to give us some thoughts in response.
Well, thanks, Robert. That was really interesting, Sam. Fascinating set of slides. And I think what it really illustrates is confidence is everything. And those are perceptions. Obviously, those are the opinions of the public from what they've seen. And I do think, from my own constituency caseload, that people have been on a journey. To start with, every MP was overwhelmed with casework from people who were terrified about, loo rolls and their own health and so on, and how are they going to be able to manage. And then it moved into the businesses saying, we really need support here. We've got to survive through this next few weeks. So there was real panic stations at every level. And then, of course, the government came out and effectively took away a lot of those concerns, at least temporarily, by offering furloughing for staff, small business grants, support for the self-employed and so on. And it's interesting that now still those who are company directors paying themselves through dividends and are therefore not eligible for support through the government schemes are the ones who are most concerned and most upset, quite understandably, because they've not had the same level of support that they see others in the economy have had. But I also do think, Sam, that would in a way point to why people in the UK are so concerned about lifting the lockdown restrictions. So, I mean, I don't know what the package is in Hong Kong. I know that the Chancellor says the UK has the most generous package in the world. In Hong Kong, is it a matter of, you know, life and death economically that they get restarted? Because at the moment in the UK, it certainly isn't. So, in a sense, the support that the government's providing is enabling people to prioritise health over the virus. And it's going to be really important that we do start to take those baby steps to unlock the economy, because otherwise we are on a fool's errand of kidding ourselves that we can carry on like this. Because of course, the reality is that the future is we have to pay for it. And that is going to be incredibly painful. And you also point to the fact, Sam, that people want clarity. They want to know exactly what's going to happen and when. And the thing is that that's the one thing they cannot be given. So the whole sort of argument about the stay alert advice and whether it was meaningful or not, ultimately what it is telling people to do is to keep watching this space. So keep looking at the way that the virus moves. Does R stay under 1? Does it move up again? Are people taking the cautious, sensible measures to stay well, to stop themselves and others from spreading the virus? So there's a huge amount of personal responsibility in all of this. And so the clarity that people are calling for simply can't be delivered. So on the one hand, in the UK, we are significantly helping people and protecting business, protecting jobs, protecting the economy. On the other hand, people do need to recognise that we all have a responsibility to get back to some sort of new normal. Otherwise, the economy is going to pay the most devastating price. And that really takes me on to that. I mean, I came in as a new MP in 2010 after 25 years in finance, and with what we thought then was the biggest financial crisis ever in, you know, certainly in peacetime. And here we are with a significantly greater financial crisis, with potentially a deficit this year alone of £250 billion. So the deficit will rise massively. And, you know, the government will already be considering whether that means long-term, perhaps 100-year bonds to cover the cost of that. There are other countries and the European Union already issuing debt, very long-term debt, to try and cover some of the costs. There is going to be the need for a lot of corporate debt restructuring. So companies who've taken out C-bills or bounce-back loans are going to really struggle to repay them in any short order, because we don't know the speed at which the economy can recover. What we do know is that when the furlough ends, that for a lot of people, sadly, their jobs will not still be available to them unless things change quite dramatically. And at the moment, it's hard to see how that happens. And then inevitably, as with any financial crisis, that hits the poor, and it means a growth in disadvantage. So all of the fears that people have, and in a sense, you can understand the weakening confidence in the government's message, tracks the fact that reality is starting to dawn, and the damage, the fundamental damage that is done to an economy of what we've had to do, where saving lives is absolutely the right top priority, but also getting back is vital. Now, I'm not one for constant doom mongering, so I do think that there are some potential opportunities from this appalling crisis. And one of those I genuinely believe is flexible work. Now, what we have is an economy, and as business secretary, I found that we are really underutilising our human assets, and our productivity is low on an internationally uncompetitive basis. And so those two things mean there is scope both to greater automate, to invest in capital infrastructure and physical infrastructure, but also to provide flexible working arrangements, in particular, to get many more talented, well, in particular, women back into the workplace, because we have just shown beyond any shadow of a doubt that we can all work flexibly. The opportunity to work from home, to perhaps hot desk, to do more about flexible working, to make flexible work standard. That doesn't necessarily mean always working from home, but it could mean working more part-time work, more job sharing work, and so on. There is a big opportunity there, and I think businesses should seize that advantage. I think another big possibility, which has been there for some time now, which we really need to seize, and without this pandemic, I think we would have been, and that is the whole world of green technology. So at the moment, we have just under 500,000 green tech jobs in the UK. That could grow to 2 million by 2030. The UK is at the forefront in the world in green technology in terms of the science and innovation. We're not so good at the build out. We don't have nearly enough capital available to businesses to actually build their own businesses here in the UK, so they too often sell out. But we also do have the opportunity to level up with a shared prosperity fund and with the Prime Minister's levelling up agenda to build those decarbonised, whether it's carbon capture, usage and storage, more offshore wind, greening our vehicle sector and so on. And then another area of great opportunity, I do think, is onshoring of supply chains and people. You know, it's been extraordinary that we didn't build our own ventilators or even make our own PPE. And just in my own area of Silverstone, the high-tech sector here, the Silverstone Technology Cluster, are turning their hands to making UK homegrown PPE. Now, obviously, we want to be exporting to the rest of the world and continuing to trade, but there are some opportunities from onshoring, not just of manufacturing, but also of people. And I'll leave you with the thought that I was talking to a senior NHS official just recently. He was saying 450,000 people have applied to the NHS jobs, to the NHS for new jobs and to fill some of those gaps. So it's not all bad news, but it's going to be a very, very difficult few years ahead. Thanks, Robert.
And thank you for a blend of optimism and pessimism there. I'll now turn to Luke, who's sort of experiencing this sort of every day in his job. But before I do, I should just say, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat while Luke is speaking, so that we can get a few going. But that doesn't mean not to pay attention to Luke Ellis.
That's right. I guess I had two big thoughts reacting to both of those. One is that my phone's just on, so let me turn that on. Apologies for that. Amazing how these things come when you don't want them. Two things. One, I think I would say the government had to act, the central bank had to act. They had to throw money when we were hit with what was clearly an extreme shock. But I'm afraid one of the things, there's no good deed goes unpunished, as they say. And we created two big problems for the future. One is enormous levels of government debt here in the US and beyond. There have been lots of academic studies showing that when countries have debt above 100% of GDP, you end up with significantly lower growth in the future. We're in a place now where we have debt above 100% today in the future, as does the US. But almost more importantly is the moral hazard that we've created around a number of businesses. Clearly, we couldn't let all of these businesses go to the wall. They had to be saved in the short term. But getting businesses off that life support of cheap money from the government, as Andrea mentioned, is going to be incredibly hard. And even more so, getting the public off what's essentially a universal basic income that was created through the furlough scheme is going to be remarkably hard. The furlough scheme appears to have worked better at that process in going into it than the US scheme, where the US, by paying extremely enhanced unemployment, basically meant people want to be unemployed rather than being employed because they can make more money being unemployed. The furlough scheme has acted well from the point of view of keeping people attached to their business. But once you get paid 80% of your salary to stay at home and not work, it becomes quite tempting to think that you want the lockdown to last for longer and longer because, hey, I'm still getting 80% of what I was earning before. And that feels sort of like, at some level, free money. So I think the success of the furlough scheme is also creates the difficulty in that polling that Sam talked about how much of the UK is keen to stay at home. Second area that I would just make a couple of points. I was struck by your choice Sam gave about the primary responsibility of a business. whether it was about growth or whether it was about being responsible. I don't see that those are a choice. Personally, I think business's job is to deliver growth while acting responsibly. And I think too much in the ESG agenda has been about one or the other. And I think shareholders as a collective force, and they do in the end have an ability to act significantly on businesses, and hopefully will act quicker on businesses than government does, will continue to drive companies to deliver growth, but act responsibly. And I think when we look at 2008-9 and the financial crisis, what we saw was that there were a number of banks that were in effect not acting responsibly because they had too much leverage, too much financial leverage, too much operational gearing in their businesses, and had no resilience built into the thing. So they couldn't withstand any amount of shock that then turned into an economic problem for the whole country. This time around, the banks have been driven over the last 10 years to run with much more resilience built into their business and less leverage. This time around, it has been companies running with no resilience. And I think shareholders, boards, and if they don't operate, then governments will generally drive companies over the next few years to run with less financial gearing and less operational gearing. And that goes to, I can't remember who was talking about just-in-time manufacturing. Just-in-time manufacturing is a good idea until you take it to the nth degree. When it was about not having 2 years of inventory and not trying to produce all of the parts that you needed to produce something yourself because you could outsource them, that's a good idea. But once you get to the point, as people did, where they had 1 day of inventory of parts in order to manufacture things, then you have no resilience built into the business. And I think, what we're going to see coming out of this is shareholders will demand from companies that they can demonstrate that they can withstand 1, 2, 3 months, however long it is, of shock to the system. This time was from the pandemic, but you ought to run a business and be able to withstand that sort of stress test. And so I think in future, companies would be expected by their shareholders to run stress tests to demonstrate that they can withstand individually a reasonable shock, so that we don't get all companies hit by this, the not being able to withstand the same shock. So with that, I'll get you back on schedule and pass it back, Robert.
Thank you very much. So Luke, so I'm actually, I'm sort of struck by something that Luke and Sam both said, which slightly boastfully, I will point out that I wrote about in an editorial from the Times at the very start of this crisis, which is the paradox of thrift, which is that an economy depends on people spending and moving and doing things. And as it was identified in recessions past, the problem comes when everyone starts. It is logical for you as an individual or you as a company to save and to rack up and to get your buffers in and to put money in your pension and make sure that if this happens again, you'll be okay. But as everyone starts doing that, then you're kind of screwed. So that's something to plant. But the question I wanted to ask Sam first of all was, and before I throw it open to the guests, is. The polling, I suspect you'd have gone through this, if we'd given you more time. But how universal are these attitudes you're talking about in terms of tax and business? Does it break down fairly clearly on party lines? Are Tory voters, generally speaking, keener to get the economy moving again, keener for business to focus on growth, and Labour voters are keener to keep the lockdown, invest in the NHS, all the rest of it? Or is there a consensus across the country?
It's it's a good question. As you mentioned right at the start, these were in the field up to just a day ago, and therefore analysing the figures, kind of quick turnaround in terms of this. It's one thing that we'd be going into and looking further. One thing we have seen, though, consistently across the board in terms of that is a recognition of the size of the bailouts, and therefore, rightly or wrongly, a view that those need to be paid down in some way and potentially quickly. That's a kind of view and its opinion. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. but that does force people into kind of immediate choices with regards to increased tax and increased regulation. And I think some of the points that Luke has made and Andrew have made, that as we progress through this and some of the health concerns start to dissipate naturally and more focus turns towards the economy, we'll see a slightly more nuanced debate with regards to what economic measures need to be put in place and where that kind of falls.
Luke, please feel free to just come in and try and have a bit more of a conversation rather than, so I guess whenever you.
Yeah, I'd just like to observe that it's interesting that the debate seems to be about health versus economy, and that issues that are incredibly important to people in normal times, such as education, climate change, national security, and so on, have been squeezed out by those. And so I do think, as Luke has said, there is this very real issue that because people are able to sit at home and still earn 80% of their incomes, it does lead them to feel that things can just be kept on hold. And so actually getting back to a new normal requires people to take an active decision. So there does need to be more of a debate actually about getting ourselves back to rights and about the reality of the position that we're in already. And I find from my own MP inbox that people just don't realise what's coming, and that I think is very concerning.
I think the tough thing from the politics point of view is almost the only way that you actually get people wanting to go back to work is to start withdrawing the free money, withdrawing the furlough scheme. But when you do that, it's going to be very painful for people because either maybe they're scared, but also mostly about financial things, because there won't be as many jobs to go back to as there were when we started. And the bit when people worried that the economy is doing poorly, I mean, that is, I'm afraid, correct. It's the nature of this thing. And so if you've been furloughed from a restaurant, if the furlough scheme disappears overnight, you're not going to get the job back at the restaurant overnight because they don't need as many people. So I think that trying to find the balance where you can release some of the free money, some of the moral hazard, without creating something where effectively you end up being the most hated government ever, is really quite difficult.
Yeah, and that's where the whole idea of new apprenticeships, new jobs in green technology, potentially new jobs in the NHS. I mean, the NHS has 100,000 vacancies and, 450,000 people have applied for them. And one of my local NHS directors was saying that the beauty of that is that a lot of the people applying are themselves local. So whereas quite often someone will take a job in the NHS and then can't afford to live there when they're doing the job, actually the people applying now already live there. So there are some opportunities. I mean, it is going to be difficult, but there are some opportunities. And so the challenge for government will be to harness where the real growth areas are. And again, you're going back to green tech, there are real growth areas for export markets, and those we've not properly investigated or seized as yet. And I think there will be some, it's not all going to be doom and gloom, but the problem is going to be that if you had a job in a restaurant, you're not going to have a job in a restaurant now. So you may want to go and have a job in a hospital or indeed on an offshore wind farm. Now that's a bit simplistic, but people are going to have to think creatively and be up for the idea of retraining and potentially moving. And these are the sorts of things that are going to be incredibly difficult.
So the questions are starting to flood in on the Q&A. I mean, we sort of going to come from that. I'm going to John Moulton, who is on the CPS board and also one of our leading venture capitalists, I think wants to contribute. So I'll try and work out how to promote him in order to even do that. But in the meantime, a couple of questions. Ian Thomas asks about, do we need, is the answer to this a strategic plan, a kind of, to pick winners, to have a national sort of recovery strategy, or should we let the market do its work? And anonymous attendee makes the interesting point that quite a lot of are people talking about paying down the debt quickly because they're kind of conditioned by the debate around austerity, and that's what they're thinking of, and that they don't see this as a 100-year debt. They see this as, you know, government, like, as you know, get into debt, you have to get out of it as quickly as you can.
We aren't going to be able to pay down the debt quickly, so
No.
there is no amount of austerity you could do which is actually going to make a rapid dent on the debt. So we do have to grow our way out of it, or in some future world inflate our way out of it, which is where 100-year bonds come in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I completely agree with you, Luke. I mean, this dwarfs the financial crisis in terms of the hit to the economy. And whilst, you know, I mean, I think everyone seized on the prospects of a massive bounce back as soon as this was over. But I think that the sort of hope for that is receding fast. And so actually, in answer to the question, I do think a recovery strategy will be necessary. I'm not a big state fan. I'm not a big government intervention fan, but this is so huge, as Luke says. You can't just simply leave normal market forces and, you know, start going for austerity and so on. This is much bigger than that.
I think there's another point as well, which Andrea kind of touched on earlier, is that people wanting clarity at this time is they can't get clarity. And I think in terms of the strategic plan, we are in that phase where the ground is moving very quickly and there's a very kind of volatile needle in terms of the R rate and all that kind of stuff. And that probably needs to settle down a little bit before you can start having that long-term strategic plan, because you can't necessarily have that clarity at the moment.
I have to say, the idea that you can sort of distill the whole economy down to a single plan, as far as I don't think that works at all. I think you can have areas that you're investing in, but I'm afraid there is no way of presenting an entire economy in a simple, clear way that the average person on the street can understand. That's sort of just not how they work. So I don't think it's about a simple plan that Boris can stand up and give a 5-minute speech and we'll all go, oh, now we know how it's going to work. The fact that we end up with, you know, every day on the radio is somebody who argues that they're the one person who hasn't got their free money out of this process, and we have to come up, you know, it's like I think we do have to let the market do it, but we can't do it in a process where we think we're going to pay back the debt in 3 or 5 years. It's going to be a 20-year process.
Yes.
Sam, do the public understand that?
No, definitely not at this point. I mean, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I do think the whole world of green technology, that is a huge growth area. I personally think it'll be bigger for the UK than financial services is today. And I think that there is great possibility for us, but of course the headwind that we're up against is this is global. You know, this isn't sort of Brexit, which affected the UK and a bit of Europe. This is something that's affected the whole world. So it will affect supply and demand and people's confidence. I mean, Luke's right, there isn't a simple plan that you could distill, but I think that what is valid is you have to have a strategy. You can't simply say, well, let the market decide and get on with it. You actually have to know what it is you're going for.
Excellent point from David Middleton in the Q&A, saying when we had a 6-year national plan in the 1960s, it was published 9 months late and the stationery office ran out of stock on the day of publication. So we shouldn't put too much faith in government planning. But Sam, I mean, you know, there are some countries, India, for example, where, you know, there does seem to be a bit more of a spirit of optimism, a bit more of a sort of, you know, people aren't quite as convinced that everything's going to be awful.
Yeah, look, India is very interesting because it has been a bit of an outlier throughout this. And in other polling that we do around the world, we always see it that there is a greater sense of optimism there. So there is a kind of cultural element as well. There is also naturally a greater focus, and it's not an either or, but in terms of economic growth and a different type of economy, there is naturally more of a kind of bent towards that. What we have seen in India in the last 2 weeks is an uptick in new infection rates and mortality rates, and therefore you also see a tick up in terms of people going back to thinking they were coming out of it, but actually now they're in the earlier stages. So I think what we'll see in India over the next 2 or 3 weeks and over the next, well, maybe over the next kind of month and 6 weeks, will be fascinating to see, because there's one economy that kind of felt as though it was starting to come out with some optimism, but has actually kind of been dragged back into it. Say, compare that with Australia and what's happening in Hong Kong.
So John Moulton has chipped in saying, yeah, I fear no need to wait for the end of furloughing to see redundancies. It's happening now. The scheme encourages early dismissals. I mean, doesn't a return to the age of the dole queue change so much about British politics? I mean, we are after the flexibility of our labour market has, after the 2008 crisis, ensured that for a period we were putting on more jobs than the rest of Europe combined. But yet now the answer, all the answers seem to be about enhancing employment protections, making it harder to fire people, all that kind of stuff. I mean, how hard will it be to stick with what's worked in the past?
So I really think this is where the flexible working should come in. The interesting thing I thought on Sam's slides is very much that people are more concerned about protecting jobs than they are about wages. And in the last couple of years, I haven't seen those slides before, but I would have thought people were more concerned about the levels of pay than about jobs because employment has been so strong. Now they're concerned about the loss of jobs. And that points towards flexibility. People will be flexible. They want to keep the jobs. And I think that also points to the fact that people are sitting at home earning only 80% of their wages and capped to 2.5 grand. And they're content with that. They'd rather with that than come in out of lockdown. So I think that is a really fruitful area to look at.
I think so. We can still have a very flexible employment economy while sorting out a whole load of the arbitrages that have been going on within the economy, where the process around gig economy, where people are really employees but have not been getting any of the employee protections. We don't need to increase the employee protections. We just need to make sure that they cover everybody in the different forms of working. Work from home is another part of that thing as to how that will operate. I think, in a similar way, we've seen a number of places where people have been using the tax system to try to adjust the way they get paid in a dividend rather than getting paid in profits because, but let's be clear why they were doing that is because you pay less taxes on your dividend income than you did on if you took it as a salary. That is, I think those types of, there needs to be an equaling out on the employee protections without them going up overall.
Which leads us actually neatly onto a question from David Triggs, which is what kind of tax changes can we have which will help with the recovery? And he also asks about the idea of debt forgiveness, for example, of rents. And Sam, I'd be interested to know what the public apart from the visceral hatred of tech companies. I mean, what are there any sort of any sense of where they'd like the money to come from beyond evil corporations?
At this early stage, no, and that's partly because we haven't kind of tested it and been able to kind of go into depth on that. There is a clear distinction, two other interesting findings which I didn't have time to include. In terms of big business or big tech companies, there is strong net support for increasing tax on those. It's a simple question. For companies that have done well out of the pandemic, that for whatever reason have flourished during the pandemic, there is half the amount of support for increasing taxes on them than there is for big business. So in terms of small businesses and small and medium-sized businesses, there is to a certain extent either no support or negative or opposition to it. So it's a much more kind of discerning case. But I think as we start moving away from people being at home furloughed and starting to see the kind of return to work and what that means for the economy, then I think you'll start seeing kind of deeper insight from people's reaction to it. But I do think it's and look, this isn't my area of expertise, but it does strike me that this is a very different type of economic downturn. In many respects, it's government enforced rather than market enforced because of the lockdown. And therefore that produces presumably different results as we come out.
I think there's a business equivalence to this problem, that sometimes when you're not making enough money, you have a cost problem, and sometimes you have a revenue problem. 2008, the reality is we had a cost problem, which required a cost, as in that there was a cost problem in government, and we needed to spend less relative to and get our costs down. This time around, to me, you can't solve it with a cost effect. You can't solve this deficit at the size it is and where we've got to by cutting. We have to find a way of solving the problem by increasing revenue. And you get this in businesses where you see people cutting and cutting, and basically they just disappear into nothing because they've cut everything that generates return. In this case, we definitely need to focus on the revenue side of the equation. That is getting growth into things, that is getting businesses that can make money, that is, trying to get more profitable things going, that can get a higher revenue share, a higher tax take through getting higher revenues, rather than just trying to squeeze a higher and higher percentage of the profits out of people.
Yeah, but I think.
Sorry, Andrea, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that there are some tax changes that the government would like to make anyway. So to review, for example, the business rates tax, which is universally unpopular, and I think the government would prefer to level up the online versus on the high street sort of tax base. Very important generator of revenues, about £45 billion a year, I think, from business rates, now down to about 30 billion because of all of the tiny businesses that have been exempted. But that would be one that would be ripe for sharing out and potentially raising more revenues that way, but in a fairer way, and certainly spreading that to online. And there are obvious problems with that, with them just sort of going offshore. So there may be more global appetite for some sort of digital taxes, but at the same time, the tax gap remains quite big, and I think that's going to be something that the government will need to really put more resource into, is closing the tax gap to make sure that people who owe their taxes are paying them.
I was just going to pick up also something that Luke said with regards to the revenue problem. What we are seeing in more advanced markets like Hong Kong is a very strong recognition among the public of the need to open the airlines and the airline sector, because of that recognition, and this is addressing the kind of revenue problem. Unless the international business tourists come back in, that is vital in terms of driving and growing Hong Kong's economy. So there is, as you progress more through the life cycle, the public to become greater aware of the levers that need to be pulled or the avenues for driving economic growth. And that is very much a kind of revenue.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes left and a host of questions. So I'm going to sort of ask a kind of lightning round thing. So if people want to sort of pick up any of the points raised. So there are a couple of questions, which is essentially about Hong Kong or China. Do we need to change our attitude on it? This is, by the way, becoming like immigration. It's becoming the thing which gets mentioned at some point in every single, thing we do. A couple of questions, which I think probably fit Andrea's brief. I mean, and Luke's actually. The relationship between business and government has been so strained over the last 4 years. Will this be repaired by the recovery? And also, how do you change the kind of the idea that FaceTime is work time? That working from home is a kind of inferior substitute. And from Oliver Colvile, great surname. How is there not going to be pressure to reward doctors and nurses and other heroes of the crisis with a pay rise? And where does the money come from that? Any of those you want to pick up on between the
I'm just going
to have a quick one at the work from home one.
You go.
Just because, so I would have been in this same camp that while we talked about letting anybody who wanted to work from home prior to the virus, very, very few people did. And I would have been firmly in the camp of thinking, yeah, but probably if they're working from home, they're not really working. We've moved, so we're now 9.5 weeks into 100% work from home, and our business has operated. So we're in the thought business, so it's easier than some, but our businesses operated incredibly effectively and really without any diminution in productivity. And it's very clear that we will have a lot of work from home in the future. Actually, in surveying the employees, we get an answer that says 80% either want to work from home some of the time or all the time in future. I'm sure the actual number will be less, but it's clear you can work from home in a lot of businesses and be very productive. And these sorts of tools that we're operating on now didn't exist 5 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago, but they mean you really can do things. So I think the bit of work from home will change significantly. We're expecting somewhere between 25% and 40% less bodies on seats in London post all of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which obviously has interesting implications for the commercial real estate market, but that's
yeah.
Oh yes.
But to just, I mean, my eldest son is a software engineer for a big bank, and his big fear is that they may say to him, never come back, we just want you to work from home from now on. So he trades the kind of swanky offices in Canary Wharf for a hovel with his flatmate, and works in his pajamas all day, which he is not up for. So actually, I mean, flexible work cuts both ways, but there's no doubt that people have now proved beyond any shadow of a doubt they can do it. I mean, in my 25 years in banking, a very long time ago now, it was always the jacket on the back of the chair. You had to be the first in and the last to leave, otherwise you were just rubbish. And I think the mentality has changed. And I do just want to say again, as the only woman in this participating in this call so far, that for so many women, they take a career break and they never get back into the world of work again because they can't get the work-life balance. So to me, flexible work isn't just about working from home, which for many people with young kids has been actually quite challenging, but it's also about thinking again about part-time work, job sharing and so on. And I think, we just need to all be very grown up about that and recognise that happy people are more productive people. And that might sound simplistic, but there's a very real world implication of adopting and embracing flexible working. So I would be a big fan of it.
And can I persuade you to weigh in on the observation that the relationship between business and government has been extremely strained in recent years?
Yeah, so I was actually going to tackle that one, and I was going to mention that awful word B for Brexit. And I think, over the last few years, a lot of the strain has come from specifically big business and Brexit and the fundamental argument over that. And so, I mean, I, as business secretary, had very productive meetings with the BROs and tried, in fact, to expand those, and got very sort of short shrift from the media, who seemed to think that that was me talking less to the big business organisations. So there's been an awful lot of mischief making, I would say. But in reality, I think the collaboration on the ground between business and government is strong. There's certainly, I would say, over this lockdown period, been massive cooperation and collaboration, and a lot of businesses are delighted with the way the government supported them. So many have said to me that the furloughing scheme has literally saved them from, choosing to fold now or just keep going for a couple of months and then folding. So, I think, yes, direct answer, I think yes. But I also think that Brexit itself has been the problem, and I can't wait until the end of this year when we finally put it behind us. And actually that also will enable business and government's relationship to reset.
And
I would say you should always be careful of maintaining a good relationship with the person that's lent you money, because they can always ask for it back.
And does anyone want to address the issues of public sector pay or indeed China, or should we leave them for another occasion?
I mean, public sector pay, Oliver Colvile is absolutely right. There will be huge pressure, and quite rightly so. And I think that's going to be potentially something that is the one thing we must do, notwithstanding that we can't afford it, notwithstanding that there's all kinds of headwinds and so on. Actually saying thank you and recognising that in a decent pay rise, I think, will be important. On the other hand, I think there's been quite a lot of effort made to ensure that health staff, certainly in the NHS, are better rewarded in recent years. And the big investment in the NHS has also been a direction of travel. There's no doubt we would, as government, love to make a big statement to the NHS, but I'm quite sure that the government will do something for them.
And Sam, that would fit with the polling that you showing that that's the kind of top priority.
Certainly in terms of investing in the health service, and I think that's wider than just wages. I think that's in terms of equipment and technology and that type of thing as well. So I think there is certainly wide recognition and support for that. And then I are looking from the public towards business as we look at economic growth and stepping up into that role.
Well, obviously at the CPS we believe firmly in private sector-led growth, and restrained state spending. But on this, we are sometimes defeated by the the views of the British public, and indeed the demands of demographics. Unless anyone has anything else that they want to add, can I thank you all so much for a really fascinating session. I'm sure everyone will agree with me that it's been really, really interesting. Sam, I think and hope that we'll be able to see that that polling afterwards in an article, but and as well, this will be available on YouTube. My WhatsApp messages tell me that the signal did get through, so if anyone wants to go back over anything from this event, please, you can find us there. In the meantime, thank you so much to our panelists, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
A lot.